Well, my thoughts would be, as I said, based from what they mentioned, it will be on the economic justice and the link between climate justice, economic justice issues, and also the need for systemic alternatives. Many of the groups, the movements I've been into, without at first knowing it, because, well, we're talking here of 30 years, before climate justice or climate changes become popular, many of them had been working for justice, especially questioning the development model that we all know now. And that is actually the center of the problem, because the climate crisis is a systemic crisis. So beyond environmental, it is about the development, it's about politics, it's about the way we think about economics, the way we think about security, the very way that wealth is produced, the system of production and consumption. In short, the way that the whole world is being running through a development or towards, and at the same time molded in thinking that to be able to be called ourselves developed, then we have to be capitalist, we have to be consumerist, we have to produce, and we have to think of a certain way of achieving those. So climate justice, as I mentioned, is also being a development issue and a question of economic justice as well. We can see that the big challenge of solving inequality and the climate crisis are very, very intimately related. And these are the biggest challenges that we are facing at the moment. And if we will look at what are the things that are being done about them. So if we look at the centers of solution making of those processes, be it from the global level, from the UN level, from the national level, policy making, and in the global level, most of these current or mainstream approaches have been failing us. If we come to think of it, it's already 24 years of climate negotiation. And since the climate negotiation started, we're not getting any closer to the solutions where we need to arrive at. We are in fact going towards a different direction. And part of that problem, it lies at the heart of a situation or reality that there is an asymmetry of power between states, between corporations, between community and people. And this is linked to what I mentioned earlier, that when we analyze what is the problem, we give our prognosis, and then we think of solutions and how to get there, this asymmetry of power is always at play. Because corporations will have their say and will have their analysis and solutions, government will have their solutions, and people in community would also have their alternatives. And in this battle of idea, unfortunately, the alternatives is still not being seen as the solution. Although all these alternatives are already out there, it's already being practiced, lived in, as Arundhati Roy mentioned, it's already pulsating, alive. But it is not being mainstreamed, it's not being practiced, it's not being accepted, and many people are actually afraid of them because it will change the way that people live. It will change the way that people will approach, think, and understand development and how we should live our lives. So I'm always saying that it's fine if people talk about putting solar panels on their roofs, or becoming vegan, or not fly and walk every day to work. That's fine. But don't ever think that that's enough, because that will never be enough. We can plant trees for 200 years, but the climate will continue to be worse if we don't change and if we don't fight the forces that are refusing to solve the crisis. So I wanted to talk here of what is appropriate, or what are the appropriate solutions, and at the same time, how do we actually get there? At the moment, as I mentioned, there are already alternatives that have been written. There's the growth, there's the globalization, there's the buen vivir, the thinking that menos para mejor, less is more, or there's that thinking of the rights of Mother Earth, that we are part of this ecological system where everybody should have a right. In economic terms, when governments think of investment, the worst part is that they only think of investment as a foreign investment, whether it's in the northern or southern countries, and it must only be in the matter of monetary terms. It is the small farmers that are feeding the world. It has been recognized in so many studies, has been again and again being mentioned by FAO, the Food Authority, and the UN, are not being seen as investors. The environment is not being seen as investors. No plant will grow without the sun, or without the wind, or without the healthy soil, but they are not being seen as equal to economic investors, or from transnational corporations that will come and they have the power to go anywhere, everywhere, anytime, and do everything. And governments have very, very little power to stop them or to regulate them, because unfortunately, most of our governments have signed, and this is the link to some of our work, signed to economic partnership agreements or free trade treaties wherein corporations now have powers to sue a government when they think that their profits will be at stake. So that is now the kind of place that the world has never been into before. This power of corporations. I had been attending the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2007, and then I stopped in 2012 because I got utterly frustrated. We were fighting to keep the Kyoto Protocol. It's not perfect, I know. And it was even accepted in exchange of letting in the clean development mechanism in its place, which provided a lot of loopholes that will make it impossible. And then from that point, where there's supposed to be responsibilities, first and foremost, from the Annex 1 countries or the rich countries, and that is another inequality, because in the use of all the fossil fuels and carbon emissions, there's a gross inequality in who benefited with them, and that inequality also produced economic inequality. And then in the UN negotiations, we will hear about other people talking about the problem is actually population. The poor countries have so many children and producing so many children. And we've been arguing, hello, like maybe a consumption of 1 American is equivalent to the consumption of 20 Indians, and maybe 8 Chinese now, and maybe 12 to 14 Filipinos. So if we're talking about population, then maybe other people in other countries should stop reproducing. And of course, that is another argument.
The education here as well to recognize it and stop. But we do, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And then there's also the question of the climate debt, what we call the climate debt, wherein actually this is never heard of now in the last 3 years, that people just stop acknowledging that the way that the South, where there is development for the rich countries at the expense of those that were left undeveloped. And for that purpose, there was a suggestion before in that this is 2008 that we should put into consideration that concept of environmental or climate debt. And this was proposed by the G77. That did not get into any major discussion. So what are the elements that we need now? Or what are the missing elements when we talk about climate change? And I have listed some here. And what I see, or many people who have the same viewpoint as me, as what is missing in the discourse. Many of the solutions that are being offered do not talk about disrupting the existing class and power relations. So, especially the fact now that we have this voluntary mechanisms and voluntary targets that countries can apply, or they are at the end of the day, they were left to do what they are prepared to do, and not what every country should do. And this is what I was saying earlier, that before we have a thinking that there should be discussions about what will be the responsibilities from each countries according to to how much polluting they have done, or how much carbon emission they have emitted. So this kind of politics is quite lacking in the discussion. The idea that we should change these power relations in the way that we produce wealth and do production and consumption, it might be high on the individual level, but not on the systemic level. And two, politics is also excluded in the analysis. When many of the officials talk about solutions, the discussion about should it be done on the individual basis, that is higher than should it be done in a way that is more that is more in the national level, or wherein people's lifestyle might be edited. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, the way we transport materials, the way we transport people. So so at the moment, people feel good that they are buying electric cars, but not about more public transportation system so that there will be more impact. And at the same time, the question of what we are producing, for whom, and for what purpose is also totally out of the picture. I also have some questions and challenges that I believe, and that would be maybe 3 or 4, and that is, how do we transform this unjust the injustices in this scenario and in this reality, and how do we induce a paradigm shift in the development thinking? As I mentioned, there are already all those alternatives, but they are not being accepted as the appropriate solution. So how can we push for those alternatives to be in the mainstream? 2, how do we overhaul the system that everybody accepts as it should be? Before we call it, there's no alternative. But now, how do we look at alternatives like the growth? How can it be translated into actual policies? And 3rd, how do we make development equitable? Because that is part also of these huge injustices. And of course, 4th, how do we defend a fragile ecosystem? The last, I said I did not attend all the climate negotiations after 2012. Last year, I need to co-organize an energy workshop, so I was there. And when I was getting into one of the workshops or side events, I heard the CEO of Shell boasting that they actually drafted the Paris Agreement. So this is the extent. I think this will be my last point. The power of corporation is so much. We're talking here of corporate capture. We're talking here of extreme power, where they can already say very frankly and very boldly that actually we wrote the Paris Agreement. So how do we stop this? And there are many measures. There's a UN binding treaty in proposals to make transnational corporations accountable. There's all these trade agreements that we can stop here in the UK. Because sadly, most of the post-Brexit trade relations and economic relations doesn't look very good. most of the negotiation looked like we're building an empire 2.0. So how do we change that? So when you say more activism, more actions, more new thinking, more alternative thinking, and more out-of-the-box thinking. So I think I will end there. Thank you very much.